trace your finger across West Africa on a world map Mali, to the south Ghana to the north. Thus lands stretching between them may soon become one of the world's most strategic regions. Burkina Faso, long known for its gold mines, has now entered the radar of global powers for an entirely different reason. And at the center of this story lies a troubling reality. Ibrahim Traoré, who seized power through a military coup in 2022, is displaying questionable maneuvers. The West's passion for the electric vehicle revolution is ironically made possible by dirty cobalt picks in the hands of children in Africa's poorest regions. The European Union's decision to ban internal combustion engines by 2035, Tesla's ever-increasing production targets, and the US efforts to reduce dependence on China are turning Burkina Faso's cobalt deposits into the focal point of global powers. How Traoré positions himself in this grand game will determine not only his country's fate, but whether the West's clean energy dreams will come true. France's colonial legacy in Burkina Faso makes the cobalt issue even more complex. After centuries under French colonial rule, the country has now re-entered the radar of Western powers through its cobalt reserves. However, Traoré's anti-Western rhetoric and decision to expel French soldiers have strained relations with traditional allies. This situation jeopardizes the chance of cooperation with the West on cobalt. The United States' critical minerals strategy views Burkina Faso as an important potential partner. Washington's desire to break China's hegemony in the cobalt market makes alternative African sources valuable. However, Traoré's drift away from democratic values is creating serious opposition in the US Congress to cooperation with Burkina Faso. Europe's Green Deal project has made billions of euros worth of electric vehicle investments dependent on cobalt security. The electric transformation plans of German automotive giants like Volkswagen, Mercedes and BMW collapse without reliable cobalt supply. Burkina Faso has the potential to meet this critical need. But Traoré's unpredictable policies leave European investors hesitant. Canada's expertise in mining technology and Burkina Faso's cobalt deposits present a natural synergy. Canadian companies are world leaders in environmentally compliant mining. However, Traoré's anti-transparency stance stands as the biggest obstacle to this potential partnership. Cobalt's story embodies modern era's greatest contradiction on one side, environmentally friendly electric vehicles on the other. Child labor and environmental destruction in Africa's poorest regions. Burkina Faso's place in this equation became a closely watched issue by the international community, especially with Traoré's rise to power. Ibrahim Traoré, despite being only 34 years old, is a figure holding Burkina Faso's destiny in his hands. The military coup he executed in September 2022 interrupted democratic processes in the country, while his stance on cobalt deposits has raised major concerns in the international community. Although Traoré claims in official statements that he will use the country's natural resources for the people's benefit. What's happening on the ground? Questions, assertions. Mali's cobalt discoveries, due to the similarity of regional geological formations, indicate that Burkina Faso also possesses significant cobalt reserves. Experts suggest that important cobalt deposits could be found especially in the country's northeastern regions. However, Traoré's approach to this issue appears far from transparent and quite problematic. Closed-door meetings with international mining companies lack of public information and disregard for environmental impact assessments are causing serious concerns. Particularly the close relationships established with Chinese and Russian companies are increasing. Western countries' fears of losing influence in the region Cobalt's strategic importance extends beyond electric vehicle batteries. It has wide applications from renewable energy storage to smartphones. The amount of cobalt Tesla needs to meet its annual production targets exceeds a small country's annual production Traorés. Cobalt's strategy is defended with claims of ensuring the country's economic independence. However, what's actually happening is far from supporting their statements. Non-transparent processes for granting mining licenses, forced displacement of local people from their lands, and neglect of environmental protections question the real intentions of Traoré's administration. Burkina Faso's cobalt potential is supported not only by geological data, but also by developments in neighboring countries. Cobalt deposits discovered in Mali's Falia region. The Sahel's characteristic geological formations provide suitable conditions for cobalt mineralization. However, the technology, financing, and expertise needed to realize this potential exceed Burkina Faso's capacity. This forces the country into cooperation with international partners. There are strong suspicions that Traoré prioritizes personal and political interests in these partnerships. Electric vehicle market growth has pushed cobalt demand to astronomical levels. Global demand of 140 tons in 2020 will exceed 300,000 tons in 2030. This increase exponentially raises the strategic importance of countries with cobalt reserves. The most criticized point in Traoré's cobalt policies is the disregard for environmental and social impacts. Cobalt mining is inherently an environmentally damaging activity in an agriculturally based country like Burkina Faso Dandine. Ignoring these impacts can lead to irreversible long-term damage. How local people will be affected by mining activities is Traoré administration's biggest dilemma. As seen in most African countries, natural resource wealth paradoxically causes people's impoverishment. Burkina Faso's escape from this resource curse is possible with transparent governance, but Traoré's practices offer no hope. International community's interest in Burkina Faso's cobalt potential is not only economic, but also has geopolitical dimensions. The US and European Union pursue active policies regarding access to strategic mineral resources to balance China's influence in Africa. Trudeau's relationships with the Russian Wagner Group are another factor increasing Western counts concerns. Wagner's activities in Africa are typically built around natural resource control. Burkina Faso's cobalt deposits coming under this group's control could increase Russia's influence in the international cobalt market. The technical difficulties of cobalt mining cannot be overlooked. Either cobalt is usually found together with nickel and copper, requiring complex processes for separation. Burkina Faso's lack of this capacity increases dependence on foreign companies. Environmental sustainability is the most complex dimension of cobalt mining. Ironically, the cobalt needed for electric vehicles to be environmentally friendly causes major environmental damage during extraction. Traoré's cobalt policies. Another problematic area is the risk of human rights violations. Child labor and forced labor cases in cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo have drawn major international public reaction. Burkina Faso needs strong protection mechanisms to avoid the same mistake from an economic perspective. Cobalt exports can significantly increase Burkina Faso's GDP. However, sustainability depends on proper revenue management. The Dutch disease risk experienced by oil-rich African countries also applies to Burkina. Our Faso technological developments include factors that both increase and decrease cobalt demand. While electric vehicle production growth raises demand, cobalt alternative battery technologies increase long-term risk. International financial institutions' approach to cobalt projects in Burkina Faso is also noteworthy. Institutions like the World Bank and IMF impose strict conditions regarding compliance with environmental and social standards. Regional integration perspective shows that Burkina Faso's cobalt potential could increase cooperation among West African countries, developing joint cobalt policies with Mali, Ghana, and Kivuar could enhance bargaining power. However, Traoré's approach to regional cooperation is unclear. Volatility in cobalt prices is a major risk for Burkina Faso's economic planning. Prices that reached $80.00 per ton in 2022 fell to $30,000 in 2023. These fluctuations show the risk of plans based on cobalt revenues. Transparency in Traoré's cobalt policies is critically important for gaining international investors' confidence. Clear information is needed on how mining licenses are granted, how revenues are shared, and how environmental standards are implemented. Currently, there's insufficient transparency on these issues. How local people will benefit from mining activities is vital for social peace. Concrete steps need to be taken in job creation, developing local infrastructure, and increasing educational opportunities. Traoré's promises in those areas haven't been implemented yet. Cobalt mining's impact on water resources is a critical issue for agricultural country mining activities. Affecting the water table could endanger agricultural production. Comprehensive environmental impact assessments are essential to minimize this risk. Developments in the international cobalt market directly affect Burkina Faso's strategy. China's dominance in cobalt refining causes the low share of raw cobalt extracted from Africa in the value chain. How Traoré will solve this problem is unclear. London Metal Exchange cobalt price fluctuations directly affect Burkina Faso's economic fate. While Traoré's failure to understand thus global financial mechanisms is concerning, investment banks on Wall Street develop derivative products based on African cobalt, producers' future production. While Burkina Faso remains outside this complex game, the European Commission's Critical Raw Materials Act in Brussels aims to reduce EU's external dependence on strategic minerals like cobalt. This law envisions establishing long-term partnerships with producer countries like Burkina Faso. However, EU's human rights and democratic governance conditions conflict with Traoré's authoritarian regime. Britain's post-Brexit Global Britain strategy has made access to African cobalt resources critical. London focused on building strategic partnerships, even with non-Commonwealth countries. Burkina Faso is one of the potential parts of this strategy. But Traoré's distant approach to British values jeopardizes this opportunity. Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund has taken a pioneering role in sustainable cobalt investments. This $4 trillion fund's interest in Burkina Faso could provide enormous financing to the country's cobalt sector. However, Norway's strict environmental and ethical standards are incompatible with Traoré's current policies. a synergistic potential exists between Australia's leadership in cobalt processing technology and Burkina Faso's raw cobalt reserves. However, Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy and democracy emphasis make cooperation with the Traoré regime difficult, the most dangerous element. In Traoré's cobalt strategy is perhaps the authoritarian structure established after the military coup being close to criticism in a sector like cobalt mining, with complex and long-term consequences, silencing civil society academics and opposition. Voices can lead to irreparable mistakes. Weakening Burkina Faso's democratic institutions stands as the biggest obstacle to transparent management of cobalt revenues. Manipulative practices in the global cobalt market also pose major threats too. Burkina Faso price games by major cobalt traders are enough to shake developing producer counts economies. What measures Traoré will take against these manipulations will determine the stability of the country's cobalt revenues. However, currently, no strategy is visible on this issue. Security problems work in AESO experiences with neighboring countries, create additional risks for cobalt mining, increased activities of terrorist organizations in the region, threaten mining sites' security trails. Security policies directly affect the sustainability of cobalt investments. Investors avoid developing long-term projects in regions without security guarantees. Cobalt mining's impact on groundwater systems is vital for a semi-arid climate country like Burkina Faso. Mining activities polluting or lowering the water table could endanger millions of people's water sources. Traoré's approach to this issue risks the country's long-term water security electric vehicle manufacturers increasing. Social responsibility pressure in cobalt supply creates both opportunities and threats for Burkina technology. Giants like Tesla, Apple and Samsung must guarantee no human rights violations in their cobalt supply chains. This situation advantages producers meeting ethical standards, while Traoré's current approach risks missing this opportunity. Cobalt mining's impact on local communities isn't limited to economic dimensions. Disruption of traditional lifestyles, erosion of cultural values, and dissolution of social structure can be inevitable consequences of mining activities. Burkina Faso needs to balance preserving its rich cultural heritage with cobalt mining. Climate change is another factor ignored in Burkina Faso's cobalt strategy. Rising temperatures and irregular rainfall patterns can negatively affect mining activities. Additionally, cobalt extractions. Carbon footprint may conflict with the country's climate commitments. Traoré has no plans on these issues. International arbitration. Courts' role in mining disputes carries serious risks for Burkina Faso. Mining licenses granted through non-transparent processes can lead to legal problems in the future. The international law compliance of agreements made with foreign investors can affect the country's sovereignty rights. Rapid development in cobalt processing technology. Make Burkina Faso's strategic planning. Difficult development of new refining techniques can make existing facilities obsolete. Traoré's inadequacy in foreseeing technological changes jeopardizes the country's long-term competitiveness. Cobalt mining's impact on female workers is critical for Burkina Faso's social development. The mining sector's traditionally male-dominated structure can prevent women's economic participation. Traoré's indifference to gender equality negatively affects the country's social development. Burkina Faso's position in regional power balances is strategically important for cobalt diplomacy. Cobalt alliances, too, be established with Niger, Mali, and Ghana could increase international bargaining power. However, Traoré's lack of regional leadership vision prevents capitalizing on this opportunity. Research on cobalt mining's health effects reveals concerning results inhaling cobalt dust can cause serious lung diseases. Burkina Faso's health system's unpreparedness for these risks creates major threats to worker health fragilities in the global supply chain. Create opportunities for Burkina Faso's cobalt. Exports the COVID-19 pandemic and geopolitical tensions increase the need for supply diversification. However, Traoré's capacity to evaluate these opportunities appears limited. Education systems, adaptation to cobalt mining is critical for Burkina Faso's. Long-term success experts need to be trained in mining engineering. Environmental sciences and chemistry Traoré's insufficient attention to educational reforms prevents closing this gap. Cobalt mining's impact on the tourism sector cannot be ignored. Either destruction of Burkina Faso's natural beauties by mining activities could negatively affect tourism revenues. Establishing balance between these sectors is important for sustainable development. Determining the exact amount of cobalt reserves requires geological research that hasn't been conducted at sufficient levels in Burkina Faso. Yet the Traoré administration's hasty approach prevents proper evaluation of the country's real cobalt potential. This situation can lead to misleading. Both investors and the public international cobalt certification systems have begun forcibly imposing ethical production standards. Platforms like the Responsible Cobalt Initiative require producer countries to meet certain standards. Traoré's indifference to these certification processes can cause Burkina Faso cobalt to lose value. In premium markets, cobalt mining's high dependence on electrical infrastructure directly affects Burkina Faso's energy policies. The country's insufficient electricity generation capacity prevents establishing large-scale cobalt processing facilities. This technical constraint eliminates the chance of value-added production and condemns the country to being a raw material exporter. In conclusion, Burkina Faso's cobalt story has just begun to be written. The decisions Ibrahimtraoré makes will affect not only his country's, but the entire region's fate, as cobalt advances towards becoming the petroleum of the 21st century, where Burkina Faso will position itself in this great race depends on Traoré's leadership capacity. However, evaluating current practices, the country's risk of missing this historic opportunity appears high in this grand game. Burkina Faso's future will be shaped by Traoré's decisions. Cobalt can be a great blessing for the country, but when mismanaged, it can also become a curse. Time will tell whether Traoré can pass this critical test.